Welcome to Hope at Night, featuring James Standish, Bettina Kraus, Q&A with our live audience, and host Anil Kanda. Today's episode, Religious Nationalism, Solution or Threat. And here's your host, Anil Kanda.
Are there pros and cons to having a country run by religious nationalists? Helping us to answer these questions is someone who has worked for the U.S. government as Executive Director of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He has held official positions on White House and United Nations committees and led broad coalitions at the United Nations and Capitol Hill. Please welcome to Hope at Night, James Standish. James, thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background and experience?
I grew up on a tropical island off the coast of Malaysia, a place called Penang. And my father was a missionary doctor, so that's how I ended up over there as a kid. And I went to college in England, eventually came to the United States, did an MBA down at University of Virginia, and then hadn't suffered enough, so I went back to law school and did a law degree at Georgetown. So I worked for the U.S. government, and I've also done some work at the UN. Really focused on religious freedom issues. Now I have my own firm because I'm a lawyer, and I work for a variety of different clients, working on complex issues, sometimes religious freedom related, sometimes in other areas.
Now, let's jump right into this topic of religious nationalism. What's the big deal about that?
Well, it's kind of an interesting term. Typically, the term that's used is Christian nationalism. And like a lot of things that you hear in the public square, it's a little bit complicated to unpack. And the first thing I'll notice is this, and this is important. Christian nationalism is typically a term used by people who oppose Christian nationalism, not by the people who they're critiquing. But the basic idea is that there's people in America who are Christians who believe that the United States was a Christian nation at its founding, that it should be a Christian nation now and going forward, who perceive trends in the United States as going against that idea. They want to do something about it, so they're involved in the public square. So they're typically conservative evangelicals, because as we know, there's liberal evangelicals, politically I'm talking, not theologically. So that's who we're typically talking about, and a whole host of policy positions and also candidates that organize around that idea.
James, have we seen from history the problems of religious nationalism?
Well, the funny thing is, we're sort of talking about it as if it's a new idea. It's actually the norm in society. And the United States broke that norm. So I've lived in predominantly Muslim countries, predominantly Buddhist countries, and predominantly Christian countries. And typically, if you go back in almost any country's history, there was a point where the state and the religion were both the same thing, more or less. And even in Great Britain today, King Charles is head of the Church of England. Now, you might look at that and say, well, that's not really a problem. They have religious diversity. It's not a big deal. And you're right, to a large degree. But if you go back in history, it was a very big deal. That's how the Pilgrims ended up coming to the United States, was to flee the religious unity of church and state. And you have the same thing in France, where we have the King of France organized a massacre of the Huguenots. You have problems where, in the state of Maryland, for example, before the United States was formed, where the government was first set up to be a shelter for Catholics because they were being persecuted in the United Kingdom. But then once the demographics of the state changed, it actually started persecuting or discriminating against Catholics. It was a winner-take-all system. You wanted to be on the winner side of the religious and the political divide. That's what the United States was founded to end in much.
James, what you're describing essentially here with this idea of religious nationalism, which includes Christian nationalism, is essentially when religion and state combined, where you have the religious side of society begin to hold hands and make laws in connection with the secular side, the political secular side.
Well, that's right, but it's complicated because all laws must, we hope, have a moral.
Yeah, all laws are moral laws, right?
These are all built on ideas of morality, and of course our ideas of morality is impacted, or in some cases pervasively impacted, by our faith. So you can never have this idea of we're only going to have a secularist mentality, because that is an exclusion of religious ideas. But the question then becomes, so it's really a matter of degree. If we're talking about a society where non-Christians are discriminated against, treated like second-class citizens, where we have religious tests for office, where we use the state to promote a particular denomination or even faith group, that's wrong.
So I like what you're saying. What you're doing is, let's avoid the blanket terms here. Let's get into some of the specifics. Now, I got to just ask you, do you think that Christian nationalism is a threat to American democracy right now?
I think that Christian nationalism, in some cases, contributes to ideas that are very dangerous. Absolutely. Do I think secular philosophies are also a danger to the United States? I do. We're in a situation in the United States where both major political parties have trended to the extremes. The more you get to the edges of political discourse, the more dangerous things come for those who don't agree. This is, as a general rule of thumb, that's not just in the United States. We see this in Latin America. We see it in European history. I sometimes joke that I feel like I've woken up in Spain in the 1930s, where you have a choice between a nationalist, sort of hard right movement, and on the other hand, a sort of a quite a secularist movement. And I just don't want either of those, because I know how both end. Because if those of us who've lived overseas, and also people who students of history and people who've traveled, know that the extremes of political discourse typically deliver very poor results.
For the Christian, doesn't he want morality to be part of the government? For the Christian, doesn't he want to be someone who believes in his country being prosperous and successful? Mm-hmm. What's wrong with all of that?
The central tenet of Christianity is to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that doesn't mean that we only love other Christians, and let's be honest, sometimes the disputes within Christianity are more bitter than the disputes that Christians have among other faiths. You know, sometimes people have it's like a family. Sometimes the biggest arguments are internal. The big idea here is that we have to support a society that has a big tent of plex issues. That's how we live together. That's how we respect each other. And the question is, where does that big tent end, and where do we have a dysfunctional, disorganized society begin? And that's a legitimate discussion, right? But it should be taken, especially within a Christian context, in the context of an idea of, I want my Muslim neighbor, my Hindu neighbor, my secularist neighbor, whoever they are, I want them to feel as home in this country as I feel. And that goes, obviously, across the boards, not because we're wishy-washy Christians, because we are living out the core of Christianity, which is to love our neighbors as ourselves.
Right. We live in a society, this isn't a theocracy in the United States. And you said the United States is not a Christian nation. But wait a minute. I remember taking history classes when I was in elementary school. I remember in junior high reading about the founding fathers being very religious, praying, Christian men, some of them were deists. Isn't Christianity the root of the United States?
It just depends what you mean by Christian nation. And I've had this discussion at the UN with folks from the Iranian government, from a whole, we often talk about, oh, this is an Islamic country, or this is a Hindu country. There is no country that has a religion. There's only individuals that have religions, and you can say this country is majority Christian, this country is majority Islamic, or whatever it is. And once you start saying this country is, well, it's a very exclusionary language. But let's get into it. The United States is inconceivable without Christianity, right? And I don't think there's a single political scholar who would disagree with that. But it's not just inconceivable without Christianity, it's also inconceivable without the Enlightenment, and some of that was secular, some of it was religious, some of it was religiously informed. It's impossible to conceive of without the Protestant Reformation as well. All of these things go into the milieu that creates the United States and then projects it forward. So you have a statement from John Adams, one of the founding fathers, and really vastly underestimated contributor to the founding of this country. I think he's the most underestimated founding father. I used to say it was Alexander Hamilton, then the book came out and the musical, and now everyone's talking about Alexander Hamilton. They need one of these books and movies or whatever. I guess they have a mini-series, but not many people watched it on John Adams. But he said that the United States Constitution is designed only for people who are moral and religious and can't work in any other context. But I think that we're seeing as the society has become more